Thank you, Stephen and the panel. Fresh from her attendance at COP27, I'm delighted to introduce Swenja Surmenski. Swenja is Managing Director, Climate and Sustainability at Marsh McLennan and Chair of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. And earlier this year, she was appointed as a member of the UK's Committee on Climate Change. Swenja is also Professor in Practice at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, part of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Swenja will be providing an update on the commitments made at COP and the increasingly important role of the private sector. Over to you, Swenja.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, I arrived late last night. There was no rain in Sharm El Sheikh, and I got very wet on my way here. So, quick reminder, I had to adjust to that. I'll share a few impression and thoughts about, COP, the whole process, but then try and bring this into the context, what are the sort of key themes and how does this matter for risk management? And I'll leave you with some thoughts that I think looking at the setup for the rest of the day and listening also to the panel, I think, there are a lot of really interesting themes that will run through the day. Well, it's a big gathering. It's the 27th COP. Let me just, okay, cool. Apparently there are now more COPs than James Bond movies. I don't know, someone told me that. I don't know if that's a bad or a good thing, but it tells you something. I mean, 27 means that we have been, in this whole global process of trying to find solutions, to negotiate, to come to agreement for 27 years. And that's only at the global space. So obviously the whole discourse, the whole recognition of climate change has been going on for much longer. I'll sometimes share this slide. I didn't have it with me, but it's a publication from Swiss Re, a reinsurance company. And it has the title, Global Warming, Still a Critical Issue for the Insurance Sector, ? And then I asked the audience to guess the date. So I'll do that. I'll ask you now to guess the date. So the title is Global Warming, Still a Critical Issue for the Insurance Sector, ? So any guesses? 2022? Well, no, much earlier. Sorry, 2000, earlier, what was it? 1990, a bit later, so it's 1996. But at that point, the question was, is it still a critical issue? Well, I think the answer is yes, and not just for the insurance sector. But I think it's a useful reminder. And as a young student, I went actually to a COP in the sort of late 90s. And, it was a much smaller affair. And there was only one industry sector represented, and it was the insurance industry. And I was there with the CEO of Munich Re, who had kindly agreed to sponsor my PhD. And they were the only ones basically at the table, the only private sector representatives at those early stages, sort of talking about their understanding of risk and what they were seeing in the context of natural disasters and emission. And it's not a secret. I mean, the physical processes have been well known. But, I think that is also quite important. So I think fast forward, COP27, a very different affair. It's, I think, the biggest COP in terms of participants. Someone said that over the course of 2 weeks, there are 35,000 people attending. I mean, a massive affair. And, there has been criticism, does it have to be so big? Does it have to be, in the middle of the desert? What's the footprint? A lot of travel. And I get all that, but I think, there's also a real case why we need this sort of global interaction. And I think when you are there, it is chaotic, it is messy, it is, but it's also, you get a real sense for the range of concerns, the range of perspectives. And, basically there are, pretty much every country in the world is represented in one way or the other. There are people from a lot of sort of different civil society organizations, often very vocal, indigenous people making very emotional speeches, and then you have industry talking about innovation. Clearly, also, oil and gas and also the coal sector represented, but also those who are really working hard with their partners to decarbonize. So I think, it is, and in the middle you have the negotiation going on, and just the negotiations are still going on. They were supposed to come to an end on Friday. They never end on time. So the Egyptian government has said they will be overrunning, and, I think you have to watch the media. I'm not going to give you a sort of running commentary on that. But I think it's fair to say we went into this COP obviously in the middle of, it's been described, the poly crisis of this year. So it's a bit of a reality check, I think, how sincere also the commitments are, but then also how quick actually the transition can move. So I'll say a few words on that. The storyline here, I don't want to go into detail, but these are some of the key terms, and most of them actually came up in the panel. Maybe just the 3 A's. So this year's it's about Africa accountability. Last year in Glasgow was very much about pledges, statements, commitments. Now it's about accountability and action. And I say a few words about some of these themes, because I think that gives you then also an idea of where that matters, where that relates to risk management and ESG. Briefly on the science, if you haven't had a look, I recommend just spending half an hour on the IPCC's website. They have got much better in making this accessible, and there are good sort of ways, videos and so on. It is really, this is the latest summary of the science. It's not a pleasant reading. It's not good in terms of where we are, but it is, speaking sort of also with a science background, it is really important that we understand that the science has come a long way. And, there is also not just admiring the problem, there are also solutions and a perspective on what needs to happen. So that is a little bit of my recommendations to you. I'm not going to go into detail, but what the IPCC has brought into COP and into the negotiations, and I guess working in the risk space, you probably are very familiar with that, but I tell you, a lot of people outside the risk community are not familiar, is this risk perspective. And I think that is actually a really tangible and useful way of framing climate change. You look at the hazard, climate change having an influence on nature, there's natural variability, exposure and vulnerability, and that sort of interplay that determines then the outcome. And I think this is actually a really useful way of sort of seeing what we need to do and where we can influence. And it is not just a question of one solution and fixing it. We need systemic responses. And I think earlier on in the panel, there was a question about, adaptation versus mitigation, emissions reduction. It can't be either or, it needs to be both. And that's also the clear message. The climate is already changing. I mean, at the moment, we're hoping that we can possibly, I think it's highly unlikely that we will achieve 1.5. But we are already, the climate has already changed, and there are impacts already. So we need already to adapt to that. So it's not really an either or question. We need both. So the big focus at COP, transition challenge. And then I think this term energy trilemma is actually a quite useful phrase. Marsh McLennan has been doing work with the World Energy Council on that for years. And it's really this question of how can we bring together energy security, equity, and environmental sustainability. And, this is in full display at the moment. And there are no single answers. But I think it's a test here of, how strong the commitments are, also how vocal the protests and how visible the political leaders are. And I think I often get asked, is it really important for political leaders to go to COP? I think it is, because it sort of galvanizes attention, but also for the negotiators, it brings, a lot of emphasis and impetus. And often political leaders don't want to go back empty-handed. They don't want to be attached to failure. So, I think that is actually important, and that underpins why COP is actually important. But then what this year has also brought home is that, I said the climate is already changing, and this year we've seen quite a few examples of how that can play out. And that makes actually the transition much harder. Because while we're trying to decarbonize and the climate is changing, actually it is becoming harder. One example is hydropower. And in a lot of countries, hydropower ran into quite significant problems this year. But for a lot of countries, hydropower is part of their transition strategy. So we need to really think this through and look at the interdependencies there. And then the resilience challenge. And yes, I mean, that is like the bread and butter, as I think, John, you said that for the insurance industry, with the caveat that the resilience challenge is not just about resilience in terms of, current risk and financial resilience and providing risk transfer solutions for today's risks. It's about very much adapting and changing the risk trajectory and preparedness and also risk reduction. And I think that is where we're seeing progress. Resilience, a couple of years ago, I would have had to give definitions and explain it. I think it has become much more mainstream. But translating that into action is, that's kind of what we need to see. And there was quite a lot of action on this and quite a lot of discussion and innovation at display. I showed some of that you can see on the slide. And at COP, there's a resilience hub. And I think this is the second time they've done it. Last year in Glasgow, there was also a resilience hub. And it's sort of a focal point for risk manager, for country representatives, for the financial sector to come together and focus on resilience. And I think that is actually quite a good development. And then there is the question of who funds resilience and where does the money come from. And that was, again, a big focus of the discussions at COP. And I'm pleased to say I was invited to speak at the Investors COP, which is a sort of separate event that happens during COP with a lot of institutional investors and banks and pension funds and, a variety of investment participants discussing COP. And they invited me to talk about adaptation investment. And I think, this is still fairly new. How does it look like? How can you invest in adaptation? What are the tools, the instruments? But it is clear that we need to have funds going into that. So this is one of the developments, I think, that is also quite, sort of taking off, and it is quite important. Well, we talked about hazard exposure vulnerability. I don't want to go into that, but just as a reminder, there are often, it requires also looking at interconnections. And I think we had reference to supply chains and cascading risk. And, if regardless of which sector you're in, that risk is not one-dimensional. And it really also requires quite a systematic approach to understanding that. And fortunately, there are good tools out there and data is becoming better. But it's often quite a challenge, and sometimes companies also rely on black box solutions. So outsourcing the analysis, getting the results, and then trying to integrate that into their solutions. I can understand, and I've been working with companies on that, and I can understand that, that is part of it, but you also need to own it. You also need to actually be involved in generating and understanding also the limitations of some of these assessments, some of the analysis. And I think we've seen this coming a long way, but I think there's still a lot of potential to also make this easier to use. And just to underline this point, I've said the climate is already changing. But clearly, we're also thinking through, the direction of travel. So, is it 1.5 degree? Is it 2 degree? Will it be 3.5 degrees? We've kind of using these temperature warming degrees as a sort of metric to get our head around it. And I think in a way it's useful because it's something tangible. I think trying to translate what it actually means, what is the big difference? I mean, if you think, well, yesterday it was 17 degrees, tomorrow it's 15 degrees, not such a big difference. But if you look at the implications that this has, because we're talking about, the change in the average global temperature, and what that means for natural systems, for disasters and so on, that is quite staggering. So here you just see the example of flooding and the interplay with, infrastructure, for example. And, you can see it matters. It really matters which degree of warming we are achieving. So that just brings it home why we actually need to do both, mitigation, adaptation. So again, at COP, a lot of focus also on solutions. And, I think this is the point where, we need to also frame this positively. And, innovation is important. So at COP, we had probably the majority of interventions, speeches, presentations were about solutions. And I think, that is really promising. And then afterwards, you could see, financial community, countries, other private sector representatives coming together and playing this through. Some of that is only happening sort of at pilots and trying it out, which, okay, fair enough. I've heard a lot of people saying, look, we don't need any pilots anymore. We need to bring this to scale. And I think that's a fair challenge, but, we also need to know what works and we need to avoid, going for the wrong solutions. So I think we need to have a good approach to that. But the important thing is there are lots of solutions that can be applied. And then the nature challenge, and we briefly touched on that. And I think this is another big focus point at COP. There's actually another COP on biodiversity happening in December. I think this is only COP 15 thing, so, they're a little bit behind. But it also illustrates, again, another global issue, but obviously heavily interlinked. So at COP in Sharm El Sheikh, a lot of focus on forests and water and, this interplay and the recognition that without actually nature, our fight against climate change is going to be very hard because nature, not only takes all of the brunt, it helps us. It's a big sort of weapon, if you like, in our fight. So the key question around, all of this, and you probably picked this up from the media and then from the coverage that is out there, is the climate finance challenge. And I'm usually not very keen in floating these immense numbers. People, I think at some point you stop also, capturing, what is it, 100 billion a year or, 4.5 trillion over time. But I think what's really important is to think this through in terms of, funding for these solutions, but also seeing how we can basically rechannel capital flows and also avoid what I call sort of lock-ins, because investments being made today, decisions being made today are putting us onto a trajectory. And the investments that you're making, that the choices that I'm making will have an impact tomorrow and in the future. And I think sort of climate finance, is not really focused on these future challenges. And I think there is a big discussion around, unlocking private capital. But linked to that is then the question, in Glasgow, we saw a lot of ambition, commitments, net zero finance. I think this year at COP, there's this sort of accountability question, concern about greenwashing as a challenge. And, this is not a secret. It is difficult. But, might there be a need for more clearer standards, more regulation? There were quite a lot of discussion on this at COP. And then I think this focus on social dimension, and I think we're speaking here also in the context of ESG. It's really important that, climate is not just about, the environment or, the economy. It's also about people. It's about the social dimension. And more investors, also impact investors, are seeing sort of the link there. And I think this was another theme that I picked up there. And then we talked about the investment in nature and nature-based solutions. But just to illustrate, there's clearly, we have come a long way. I think there are changes underway, but also our system, our sort of society system, is inherently reactive. And I use this, it's a bit of a dated figure based on my earlier research, but it has really changed fundamentally, that we just tend to be very reactive. And, we spend a lot of money in dealing with the problem once it has occurred. And we're not really funding much in terms of, sort of prevention. And, this is in the context of adaptation. But, you could also say, well, isn't this the case with the whole climate problem? I mean, we're now having to rush through the transition. If we would have started it earlier, we would have had a chance to do it more gradually in a more sort of orderly fashion. But, okay, well, that's where we are. But it's just a reminder of, where our system, and to some extent it's human nature. We are very reactive. But I think it's a useful reminder why it's also so challenging to achieve such a change. So just to bring this to a close, there are lots of tools, lots of approaches and strategies, particularly for risk managers, where you kind of connect, this more holistic view of climate risk, bring in ESG, and then take that also into your discussions, for example, with insurers. I know there are rating tools, an ESG rating tool that helps you also to then negotiate with your insurers, and bring this into the question around, are there incentives? If I do this, if I really, what are the incentives for me as a company, the savings, but also, the positive incentives. And often people mention also cultural incentives, clients, colleagues who often, I think this has become a big feature in careers where HR says, they often get asked, well, how holistic is our approach to ESG and climate? And I think, this just reflects that it's become a much broader issue than, just the single question of how can we reduce emissions or how can we adapt? And then the sort of final point, I think the key is obviously it's a question. There's not a silver bullet. There's not a solution for either the public or the private sector, and that's again why I think COP is actually helpful, because I've been involved, I've seen it, I've listened to so many discussions that would usually not really happen between different players and recognizing their different positions. And this is a very simplified diagram here, which just shows you how many agents are involved in decisions that then influence risks. And depending where you are, there might be rules and regulations on ESG, you might have risk standards and so on. But they can also quite differ. They're sometimes quite unclear. Are they implemented? Are they imposed? And, I think that is important also to see how actually, our understanding of climate and sustainability can influence those relationships and those decision change. Because once something has been built, once it's there, once it's been designed, it's quite costly to adjust and to amend. So I think that's kind of the final message, which a bit of an explanation. I think, the need for engagement, and it's partnership, it's so easy to say, well, if something is difficult, we need to collaborate and do it in partnership. But I think in this case, it is actually really good example, and there has been, good progress. But I'm afraid we will not only have COP28, but there will be probably more COPs to come. But yeah, I think, the question, do I come back from COP sort of encouraged or discouraged? I mean, I'm completely aware of the scale of the challenge, and it doesn't look good. But when you see, really the variety of different players, I think sincerely trying to work on solutions and trying to also make money with solutions, then I think that gives me an indication that there is a good chance that we will find a way to limit global warming. We can't avoid it, but that we will find a way to limit it. And yeah, with that, I'm not recommending you should all go next year to COP28. Don't. But yeah, it is. There are other ways to engage, but I think it's certainly an important process. And yeah, let's hope that by Saturday night or Sunday morning, at least, we will have on paper a better idea of where the negotiation has been going and what the results are. So with that, happy to answer any questions. Yeah. Well.
Hi, can you hear me well? Yep.
Yeah.
I'm Natalia from the IRM, and it was very interesting. Thank you very much for your speech. You mentioned about the reactive, we are being reactive, and I just wanted to ask you if we are being as well overly consumist as opposed to reactive, because for any problem, we build a solution, we create a solution, but as you said, we do not step back, we do not slow down. So my question to you is, have people spoken about slowing down, reducing mass production as well? What are the steps really that have been discussed at the COP27? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question. And I think, it's not a secret that people say, well, isn't growth the problem, or the way that, our system of growth has been designed, and isn't this part of the problem? And yeah, I mean, I think there is no easy answer. I think what's been interesting at COP is also this focus on concepts such as circular economy. And, just to be smarter about the way that we use resources. And, this idea that, we know we either can't use these resources because they are emitting, or we shouldn't, or they are limited. I think we know that we somehow have to change our way in terms of consumption of resources. And I think that, there are lots of good cases where I think also companies have made some headways. But then at the other end, you hear forecasts in terms of, projections on waste production, for example. I mean, that is quite shocking. And waste is actually a big emitting sector. And yeah, I think, this is it, but it's certainly part of the problem, yeah.
Do you feel like you've been involved in this for a while, that we're getting to greater consensus amongst different leaders in terms of what to do, and also following it up with commitment to actually enact on these things? Because as you said, these have been running for a long time. It's very easy to talk about solutions and to have pilots. The trick is actually beginning to really implement these things, identify what's really going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been a significant change. A range of countries now have set in law their climate targets, and the UK has actually been a leader. In 2008, we had a Climate Change Act that basically sets out, requirements for governments, regardless of what, changing governments, don't matter, but they set out, commitment to reduce emissions, and we have now the net zero commitment. And you see this in more and more countries. So I think that's an indication that, it's not just like a flavor of, a political, movement, but that it has become part of our governance system. But, I'm not denying the fact that, some people say, well, there's always a lot of talk and then people go home, and how much action is underpinning that. I think we're getting better in putting the finger on where, action is not happening, and it becomes a bit more transparent. And I think that's the first step to then probably seeing that sort of change. So that's why the accountability point at COP is quite big. And yeah, I think that gives me also hope, because, with better data and better information, it also becomes much clearer where action is lacking.
I think we have time for one more. John's back there.
Mine's going to be really quick, Svenja. So you can
Oh, that's always a difficult start.
So my question is: should the COP be split so that there's the negotiators actually negotiate and come to deals and solutions, and all the circus that's around it outside of the blue zone goes somewhere else and has like a Davos meeting?
I don't think that would be a good idea. I mean, I know a lot of negotiator, and it is quite a painful job because you're basically locked up for 2 weeks and are supposed to then come up with a result. And sometimes they're quite food deprived and sleep deprived. But what they need is also this, impetus from the experts, from stakeholders. And, there's quite a fertile exchange. I mean, you could also say there's lobbying from different sides at facing them. So I think that momentum and that atmosphere is important. I mean, COP is also, it's just like the annual kind of galvanization of what's been going on throughout the year, because, this doesn't stop at COP and then we wait another year and come back. The whole negotiations are being sort of prepared for and done through the year. So in a way, I think it is helpful to have this all in one place, as messy and crazy as it sometimes feels, but also to see, the mix and to listen. Just by walking past, you have quite emotional statements. You see indigenous people making protests. And I think, as a negotiator, that reminds you also what is at stake. So So I think it serves a purpose.
Just quickly to probe, and you already spoke a little bit about this, but I'm quite interested if you can shed some light on any conversations around accountability. I often worry, probably like others, about enforcement. Who's going to police this? Who's going to make sure that a lot of these commitments and pledges are upheld? And what happens if they're not, other than meeting on the next COP meeting and kind of potentially relying on shaming and people feeling like they have broken their promises on their conscience? Are there any meaningful conversations about an enforcement body or enforcement framework and accountability that we can rely on?
Yeah, that is a bit of the holy grail, I think. I mean, you can understand why that is an area that countries also, because this is then their national, autonomy, and they don't really want to make themselves accountable to another body. But in a way, we have already mechanisms. And, there is quite a lot of scrutiny by bodies, such as the United Nations. We have the UNEP emissions gap report. We have, also a lot of civil society organizations doing accountability. But it's messy, and it is not very clear. Often they use different standards, and that also creates then concerns. And I think for corporates, this is really difficult to navigate. And, I think sooner or later, we will need to come to, to global agreement on what these standards mean. Because it's also, it's really confusing in a way. It opens the door also for intentional greenwashing, but also, accidental greenwashing, because with all the best intentions, you might end up, doing or triggering something that maybe isn't so good. So I think at the moment there is a degree of uncertainty, but I think there are lots of smart people looking at ways that this can be done. And industry itself has said, look, we need clarity, and we don't also want this to get, to a stage where people are too afraid of making commitments, because that wouldn't be the right response. Yeah. There is another question if you want, but up to you. A quick one?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
I turn 50 shortly, though I know I don't look it. And my kids are now over 18, which is quite astonishing. And I've not become a green activist. However, I can remember Boutros Ghali making a very similar speech to Gutierrez about we are at a critical tipping point in climate. And I think it was a really interesting stat that you put up. Thank you. It was a really interesting stat that you put up that was 1996, 98, where we were still that far back. And you've used a couple of phrases in there that have sort of pricked my attention, such as profit and opportunity and. I just wonder, and maybe this is something to go all the way through this conference and to maybe the panel answer at the end of the day. What are we going to leave for our grandkids? And what cost are we prepared to put on that? Because I don't know about you, but I'm not prepared to say, well, we can't afford that. There is no plan it B. This is our home. We will live and die here, and we will probably die here very, very quickly if we don't start getting to grips with this quickly. And as risk managers, is it not incumbent as part of our role as critical friends to be holding people to account and to be putting these options right in front of people? Not talking about corporate profit, not talking about country GDP. Can somebody give me a number on what are they prepared to pay to make sure that we can still live on this planet, that my grandkids, your grandkids, and our great-grandkids can inherit something or anything that is livable? And I worry about that. And I'm not a green activist, I'm just Joe Public. But all I hear from COP is the same rhetoric, cop in, cop out. See what I did there? Bit of a metaphor. Cop in, cop out. Now, it's not a dig, and that's to the insurers as well, and to the investors, is what cost are you going to put on your grandkids' future, your grandkids' home?
Well, I mean, very good question. I hope the panel at the end will come up with a very good answer, because I can only say the costs that you're mentioning. I mean, some parts of the world are already paying the costs, and this is already a reality. And I was once invited by the UN to give a talk about climate risks assessment and analysis, and at the end of my talk, a lady from the Philippines stood up quite rightly and she said, it's great talk about climate risk, but can we talk about climate reality now? Because, this is for us, it's a reality. And so I think just emphasizing that. And I think society has become much more aware, but is it reflected in consumption trends? Is it reflected in behavior? I mean, I think we all... I'm not, I could improve my behavior, certainly. I've got children. How well, they get it, but is their behavior reflecting, the challenge? Sometimes yes, mostly not. So, I think it's all of that. So, it's not just a question also for governments. It's, it's all of us. So on that happy note, which is not really a good way to end it, but, I hope that gave you a bit of a sort of flavor, and I'm sure a lot of the discussion later on can pick up on some of these topics.